Joshua chapter 5. Joshua prepares his men for battle, but in a way they probably didn't expect at first. Verse 1. Now it came about when all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan to the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, heard how the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan before the sons of Israel until they had crossed, that their hearts melted, and there was no spirit in them any longer because of the sons of Israel. The inhabitants of Canaan just didn't expect the Israelites to cross the Jordan so soon, since it was at flood stage from the spring rains and melting snow from the mountains, and they were shocked and demoralized that they saw them, oh my goodness, they're all crossing at once, and they got there. And then they gather up at a place that's later known as Gilgal, and so they can see now from their the walk place on the top of the walls, the outer wall, they can see that this great mass of people that was over on the east side, they're now over on their side on the west. And oh boy, what's happening? Verse 2. At that time the Lord said to Joshua, make for yourself flint knives, and circumcise again the sons of Israel the second time. So Joshua made himself flint knives and circumcised the sons of Israel at Gibeath Haraloth. Okay, the Lord is telling Joshua to make flint knives for the purpose of circumcising all the males. And we might ask, why flint knives? Bronze was available at that time, been made and used for quite some time. Iron was also available, but the process was still not commonly known. The people who were doing it tried to keep it a secret, and it meant the implements there, they were not very common and they're very expensive. While also at the same time, flint knives were becoming obsolete because of switching over. At one time they had copper knives, then they realized you take copper and tin, mix them together, and you get a stronger metal they call bronze. One reason for using flint knives was tradition. Since the knife that Abraham was going to use to sacrifice Isaac on Mount Moriah was a flint knife, the Israelites continued to use these knives for circumcision, kind of a traditional thing. And another reason was to reflect God's command about how to build altars with uncut or shaped stones. Metal knives were never to be used because God wanted naturally shaped stones that no one had shaped. And so the rule was you can't take stones and use metal implements and hammers and chisels to shape them into squares and rectangles and so forth. You're supposed to take them as they are, like they did with the stones out of the river, piled in the river, and then on the west side that we heard in the last chapter. So God wanted naturally shaped stones that no one had shaped, and metals needed to be mined, refined, and processed, okay, in order for anybody to use it. And this shows just a lesson for us now, even in the New Testament, that God did not and doesn't need or want human help in his work. Now, of course, he wants us to be involved in his work, but he wants to work through us. It is not in our own human effort that counts. It's what happens through him that matters. He gets the glory, we get the blessing. Okay. Flint can be found naturally shaped and already sharp, and so it was suitable for circumcision. It can be very, very sharp. Now, it's also true that flint needs to be shaped to make a really good knife, but you don't have to have metal to do that. You can nap it, so to speak, with flint on flint, like the way of making projectile points and spear points by Native Americans, for example. So you can do it that way, so no metal needs to be used. Tom Bradford points out, he writes for the Torah class, man-made items are by definition not created by God, so they fall short of perfection. God is perfect, we're not. Verse 4. This is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the people who came out of Egypt, who were males, all the men of war, died in the wilderness along the way after they came out of Egypt. For all the people who came out were circumcised, but all the people who were born in the wilderness along the way as they came out of Egypt had not been circumcised. For the sons of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness until all the people, that is, the men of war who came out of Egypt, perished because they did not listen to the voice of the Lord, to whom the Lord had sworn that he would not let them see the land which the Lord had sworn to their fathers to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. Okay, in verse 4, we have an interesting choice of words going on here between there and in verse 6. In verse 4, you have people, in Hebrew is It's a word denoting God's chosen people. However, in verse 6, people is in Hebrew goy, a different word. And it means nation or people in a generic sense, and then later it meant Gentiles. This shows that the people who left Egypt went from being to goy when they rebelled against God. They were no longer spiritually in fellowship with God, and so they were denied entry into the promised land. Verse 5 tells us that there were no more circumcised men except for Joshua and Caleb, and that therefore, in a spiritual sense, there weren't any more Israelites. We can see this reflected in the book of Hosea, where the 10 northern tribes were changed by God. Their name was changed from being referred to as Ami, see that there, to Lo Ami, where Lo means not. It means changed from my people to not my people because of their disobedience and rebellion from God. Lo Ami is another way of saying goy or Gentile. Verse 6, for the sons of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness until all the nations, that is, the men of war who came out of Egypt, perished because they did not listen to the voice of the Lord, to whom the Lord had sworn that he would not let them see the land which the Lord had sworn to their fathers to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. The males who came out of Egypt were circumcised, but those who were born during those years of wandering in the wilderness were not, so they needed to be circumcised now. Why now? Well, the first Passover to be held in the Promised Land was approaching, and so all males had to be prepared for it by being circumcised. The Israelites were about to inherit the promise of land under the Abrahamic covenant, but without circumcision, they could not be counted as God's chosen people. As goy, or considered Gentiles, they couldn't participate in the Passover. In Romans chapter 2, 3, and 4, Paul uses the requirement of circumcision in a spiritual sense, meaning it is a circumcision of the heart through faith. He explains that both Jew and Gentile must go through this spiritual circumcision in order to be saved. Now, let's move on to, I don't have it here on the screen, but Colossians 2. I want to read from verse 9. Paul's writing, for in him dwells all the fullness of the Godhead bodily. Now that's Jesus he's referring to. And you are complete in him, which is the head of all principality and power, in whom also are ye circumcised with the circumcision made without hands, in putting off the body of the sins of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ, buried with him in baptism, wherein also you are risen with him through the faith of the operation of God, who hath raised him from the dead. And you, being dead in your sins, and the uncircumcision of your flesh, hath he quickened together with him, having forgiven you in all trespasses. Paul is basically building his argument here off of the passage here in Joshua 5. In verse 2, it speaks of the second circumcision. So Paul uses that to develop the idea circumcision physically is not required of us, but circumcision of the heart, meaning to accept Christ as Savior and Lord and to believe in him in faith. That is a form analogous or a metaphor for what we do as we come to Christ. Verse 7, their children whom he raised up in their place, Joshua circumcised, for they were uncircumcised, because they had not circumcised them along the way. Now, when they had finished circumcising all the nation, they remained in their places in the camp until they were healed. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." So the name of that place is called Gilgal to this day. Now, healing from circumcision took several days, and during this time the men wouldn't be able to defend against any attacks. The Canaanites were all over the place, but they didn't attack. That's because God had put a great fear of the Israelites and the Canaanites, so they held back. It also kept them back and allowed the Israelites to cross over the Jordan without being attacked. In verse 9, we see a phrase, the reproach of Egypt. Okay, Gilgal can mean rolling away or rolled or wheel in Hebrew, as we learned last Sunday. Okay, what does this reproach of Egypt mean? Well, it could mean the place where God rolled away the stigma of Egypt off the Israelites. Even after they left Egypt, they continued to worship Egyptian gods, as we see in Exodus 32, 8 through 10. Actually, I want to read this and start with verse 7. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go get you down, for your people which you brought out of the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. They have made them a molten calf, and have worshipped it, and have sacrificed thereunto, and said, These be your gods, O Israel, which have brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And the Lord said unto Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may wax hot against them, and that I may consume them, and I'll make of you a great nation. Okay, or the reproach involved the sayings of the Egyptians that God had led the Israelites out of Egypt in order to kill them in the desert, as Exodus 32:12. The act of circumcision declared the restoration to their covenant with God. Let's look at verse 12 in Exodus 32. Wherefore should the Egyptians speak and say, For mischief did he bring them out, to slay them in the mountains, and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce wrath, and repent of this evil against your people. A third possibility is that they had neglected circumcision during the time of bondage and had continued this neglect during the time of wandering in the wilderness. So we have three possibilities. It can mean that they went off and made themselves a molten calf and worshipped it, or it was the Egyptians who were saying, oh, God just took them out in the desert and into the mountains and so he can destroy them there, or they had just somehow neglected it. My thoughts on this are simply, well, I prefer the first two choices, probably the middle one there, that the Israelites had basically said, oh, God's just going to take them out and kill them. He took that off, or it could have been both together. The idea that they neglected it, I find a little troubling. If God wanted them circumcised during this time of wandering, he would have told Moses of this. After all, Moses himself had to be circumcised, and had done by his wife Zipporah, because he was standing with the angel of the Lord ready to kill him if he didn't. So I don't think it was a case of forgetting about it. Verse 8, Now when they had finished circumcising all the nation, they remained in their places in the camp until they were healed. Then the Lord said to Joshua, Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. So the name of that place is called Gilgal. We want to emphasize this and look at it. It's the Lord telling him this. Okay, and we again see that name Gilgal, which we'll get to. The circumcision of at least several 100,000 males, that's a lot of them at the least, can be compared to the spiritual circumcision of the heart described in the New Testament. Now, I'm emphasizing the number there. I don't think Joshua did this all by himself. But let's consider here for a minute, who led these people over the Jordan and also through the circumcision ceremony? It was Joshua. His name really in Hebrew is Yehoshua or Yeshua, and it means God saves. Now, who led us over the Jordan into God's rest and also into a circumcision of the heart through faith? Jesus, whose name in Hebrew is Yehoshua or Yeshua, and it means God saves. Joshua is a type of Christ. This process of circumcising all the males was completed in one day because the leaders of the families in each tribe could do this for their male family members. Now, Joshua did not circumcise all the males by himself. So how is this possible? Well, remember, all of the men, the people who were 20 and up, died in the wilderness. That meant those from 0 to 19 were circumcised. They had been circumcised back in Egypt, and they were too young to be under that curse. And so this means if you were 19 and 38 years ago, 48, 50, it'd be 57-year-old guys as possible. So Joshua could have had quite a number of men available to help him with this. And we need to remember he was told not to prepare a knife, but to prepare knives, plural. And one man's not going to use a multitude of knives all by himself. So it's been attacked that it's not possible, he couldn't do it, and so forth. Just read the Bible carefully. It will explain itself. Okay, I want to digress for a moment. In the last 20 years or so, some archaeological discoveries have kind of tied some things together here that have to do with Gilgal. And you can look it up under the giant footprints of Israel. And no, they didn't have supergiants walking around like Godzilla. But very near where Gilgal was, there is now a giant arrangement of stones which form the outline of a footprint, or actually a sandal print. And you can see it in that little picture there. Okay, you see those are date palms in a grove of date palms, I guess you call it. And you see a black object there. That's on the road. That is a tour bus going to the left. Now, that's not us. This picture was taken in 2013. But if you look down in the bottom half of that picture, you can see at the middle left kind of a oblong shape of stones, and then branching off to the lower right, you see another looping curve of stones. Now that forms like a two-part giant sandal print. So what's that all about? You can see it was huge, maybe 2 football fields long. And in Deuteronomy 11:24, the first half of that verse, every place on which the sole of your foot treads shall be yours. Treads relates to the setting of one's foot on territory in order to take ownership. Now in Ruth chapter 4, the ritual of the kinsman redeemer, a guy takes off his shoe and hands it to Boaz, showing that he was legally granting Boaz the right to redeem the property of Naomi and Ruth, as well as the person of Ruth. What you're doing here is if you're exchanging property, you're making a sale of property to somebody else, you take your shoe off, you hand it to the other guy, and he puts it on. Now you're at the property. So that means where he is standing now belongs to him, his footprint. And then also it doesn't just refer to the property itself, the land, but any structures and any people, if there's slaves or servants tied in with it, all of that, and implements, wagons and whatnot, all of it would then be handed over as a sale. And so now you understand a little bit better about what's going on in chapter 4 of Ruth. The Israelites in the days of Joshua and Judges apparently went around creating several giant sandal prints to mark their ownership of the land at various places along the Jordan Valley, and then in the adjoining hills of Samaria. It is interesting that just recently this is being found, even though Gilgal cannot be exactly located. They have a pretty good idea. The problem is these people were traveling around in tents. It's not like looking for a city. Tents don't leave much. If a bunch of people, like a couple of million people living in tents, get up and move somewhere else, Maybe for a few years, if you walked across the area, you might see a bunch of holes hammered in the ground by tent posts. They didn't have little tent pegs like we use in camping. They had a couple of foot long, big wooden spikes to hammer in the ground. So you might find that. You might find where somebody had dropped a pot and didn't bother to clean it up. Clay pot, but there's not much there. Archaeologists can't really find too many records of the Israelites, so the skeptics say, well, see, they weren't really there. But when you're trying to track archaeologically people who lived in tents and moved around a lot, you don't have much to work with. So that really strips the skeptics of their argument. And actually, it enforces it in a way. Verse 10, while the sons of Israel camped in Gilgal, they observed the Passover on the evening of the 14th day of the month on the desert plains of Jericho. On the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened cakes, and parched grain. The manna ceased on the day after they had eaten some of the produce of the land, so that the sons of Israel no longer had manna, but they ate some of the yield of the land of Canaan during that year. Passover is on the 14th of Nisan, which is their month, kind of overlaps the end of March and first half of April in our way of thinking. The 15th of Nisan, the Israelites ate produce of the land made into unleavened cakes plus parched grain. This is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, or as we know it, matzah. The 16th of Nisan, the supply of manna stopped, it ceased. Manna is a picture of Christ and his death. We see that in John 6. Let me take a moment and read that. Verse 49. Your fathers did eat manna in the wilderness and are dead. This is the bread which comes down from heaven, that a man may eat thereof and not die. I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If any man eat of this bread, he shall live forever. And the bread that I will give is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. Okay, he came down to earth, that's Jesus, as the bread of life, to give his life a ransom for many, as it says in Matthew 20. Up until now, the Israelites had eaten manna. They had it fried, they had it baked, they had it boiled, they had it fricasseed. They may have eaten it raw. They had it probably 24 different ways. And all those years, I'm sure they figured out many, many different ways of eating that stuff, because it was the same stuff every day, every day, every day. But now on, they're going to start eating kosher food as was instructed by Moses. They hadn't really been doing that. All those rules about doing that had to do with when they got to the promised land. Well, here they are. Verse 13, now it came about when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, are you for us or for our adversaries? He said, no, rather, I indeed come now as captain of the host of the Lord. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and bowed down and said to him, what has my Lord to say to his servant? By Jericho literally is in Jericho in the Hebrew, and some explain that as meaning that Joshua was mentally going through it while he was planning how to conquer it. Now, he knew about the outer wall and the inner wall, because the spies had told him all about it. They gave him a lot of different description, evidence and details. Probably told him all about that steep sloping forefront to the wall that was made of brick, and any attackers would have to go up a steeply inclined sloped forefront before they even got to the wall to try to breach it. Meanwhile, the people in Jericho could rain down rocks and arrows and spears at them all the while they're doing it. And so it was very heavily fortified. He knew about that, and he may have been mentally just mulling over, how am I going to do this? Remember, he hasn't been told how it's going to get done yet. So he's just preparing himself as a commander on how am I going to attack this? Now, others see it as meaning that he was observing Jericho while thinking about how to attack the city. as a leader of Israel, he took on the title of commander of the Israelite army. Now, he could have been just standing there at Gilgal and looking over toward the Jericho fort and wondering, okay, and trying again, imagine I can send guys here or there, just as a commander would do. He's plotting out what he's going to do. Now, Joshua was probably at the edge of the Israeli camp when he noticed a man standing in front of him with a sword drawn. Wow. And of course he's thinking, is that guy an Israelite? I don't recognize him. Maybe he's a Canaanite. We've been wondering if they're going to come down and start checking us out. So he asked the obvious question, are you for us or against us? Or in another way, we might say in the military, identify yourself. A man says no, which Hebrew is lo. So if now you know how to say no in Hebrew or not. And it meant in this case, neither. That he is a captain or prince of the host of the Lord, and it's capitals there. That means Yahweh or Yehoshua. The host here, we need to pay attention to that. It's singular. It does not mean the people of Israel who are referred to as the hosts, plural, of the Lord in Exodus 12:41. This host is synonymous with the host of heaven that we see mentioned in 1 Kings 22:19, and that means the angels of God. Now, let me read this again. Now we have verse 14 and 15. I want to read them together to lock it in our mind. He said, no, this is the angel, the captain of the host of the Lord speaking. Rather, I indeed come now as captain of the host of the Lord. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and bowed down and said to him, what has my Lord to say to his servant? The captain of the Lord's host said to Joshua, remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you're standing is holy. And Joshua did so. Okay, Joshua immediately falls down, bowing to this man. Now, writers will tell us it doesn't necessarily mean that Joshua believed the man to be the Lord, Yahweh, since he addresses him as Adonai, which just means Lord or Master or somebody who's superior in rank. I do believe, though, he recognizes this man is he's not just a man. This is special. Okay. Upon hearing the command to remove his sandals because he's standing on holy ground, Joshua realized he was in the presence of that same person who confronted Moses through the burning bush. Now, Moses probably had shared this experience with Joshua many times during those 38 years of wandering in the wilderness, and probably told him all about the events of things that happened in his own life. They, of course, spoke quite a lot, and they recounted what happened when Moses and Aaron were fighting against Pharaoh, or actually the Lord fighting against Pharaoh. Now, the practice of removing one's sandals before entering a holy place was, and it still is, common in the East and was meant to avoid defiling the site with the dirt on the sandals. This act is intended to express the reverence we owe to the Lord. Now, that's for us. Now, they also do this in Buddhism and Hinduism and Islam, and so it's not just our Lord. Even Helen and I, when we go to visit our friend who is from Taiwan, we take our shoes off when we go into her house. And so that's a habit they have there, and it's common all through the East. And remember, this part of the world we're looking at is also part of the East. It's the Middle East. Okay. Now, Joshua now knows that he's in the presence of Yahweh. So he kicks off his sandals immediately. He also realizes that the Lord is the commander, not him. It was that phrase, remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you're standing is holy. The same exact words as were given to Moses. So, something else that now Joshua is coming to realize. He was going to be the captain or commander of the Israelite army, and he discovers, no, he's not. God himself, Yahweh, is going to be the commander, and Joshua is going to serve under him and carry out his orders. And so it's a different thing that he might have thought at first. Now, what we have here is one of those ornery or bad chapter breaks. This should have either gone on into the next chapter, or chapter 5 should have stopped before we get to this man with the sword, because splitting it right in half is annoying. So anyway, we're stuck with this. So next week, though, Dan's going to teach us about one of the strangest plans of attack that any military leader has ever been told to follow. So I'm looking forward to that, and hope you have a good week.